Good morning and welcome to this week's Grow, where we gather to recharge, organize, and work here as members of MWEC. We are so glad that you're joining us with this Grow. Today, we are going to continue our media literacy series with Meredith Gardner, who is our Empower Director of Media Literacy for MWEC. This is also part of our Summer of Hope, our Hope experiment that we've been doing. If you're not familiar with that, I invite you to go to our website, and it's right at the top. You can click on it and get some suggestions of ways that you can participate in some activities that MWEG has put those suggestions together for you, and to help you have more hope in civics and in democracy as we go into this election season. So today we're going to be talking about local news sources, and Meredith is going to talk about why that's important and kind of give us some ideas of how we can kind of link those together with other news sources that we may already be subscribed to or where we're getting our news. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Meredith.
Awesome, thanks. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, awesome. Great. I'm so glad to be with you guys today. I'm really excited to talk about local news. I have a passion for local news. I used to be a reporter for multiple local news publications, and I just love it. So I'm so excited to talk to you about this. We're going to talk about some of the good things happening in local news and some of the more challenging things happening in local news. But at the end of the day, I hope that you guys can end feeling hopeful about the power that local news can have in your life as you connect with it more. So that's kind of our goal. So I wanted to start out by talking about what is local news exactly. I actually had a colleague tell me, or ask me, would you consider um, the app Nextdoor? I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. Is that considered local news? And she said it kind of jokingly, but I think it's important to define what we're talking about. So local news does not come from a Facebook group or an app like Nextdoor. Um, I participate in my neighborhood's Facebook group, and we talk about current events sometimes or things that have happened around the neighborhood. But that's not local news. Local news is produced by local reporters. Um, that's important because actually there are a number of local news outlets now that don't have local reporters. So it's not truly local news if you don't have local reporters present reporting on it. Makes it difficult. I guess I shouldn't say it's not truly local news, but it makes it a lot more difficult. It's produced by local reporters about your local area, and it provides a broad view of what's happening in your community. And it also uses the standards of journalism for editing, interviewing a variety of sources, and minimizing bias. So that's why something like your neighborhood Facebook group doesn't really fit in that. This is just a picture of a front page from the Arizona Republic, which is a local news source, and this was from a couple days ago. And why is local news important? What are the benefits of it? Local news is so important, and it's one of the reasons why I try to stay connected to it as best I can in my own area. It provides a virtual town square for people living in a community. It is so important to know what's happening in your community. And I know I moved to Texas about 4 years ago, and one of the first things I did when I moved here was I tried to get connected with my local news outlets so I could learn about what was happening in my community and I could connect with that. There's been a lot of studies about the benefits of local news, and these are a few of the other benefits. Um, Local news actually increases voter turnout when people are engaged with it, and when there's a quality local news outlet in a community, they see better voter turnout. It increases civic engagement. So when people know that there's an important city council meeting or school board meeting, people are more likely to attend that. But if they don't know about it because there's not really quality local news in their area, then fewer people are going to be engaged. And we want people to be engaged in our democratic process because that provides better outcomes for everyone. It also provides more effective governance. So local news outlets are actually incredibly important for minimizing corruption in in their cities and communities. There's so many stories of local news reporters who have uncovered corruption. I think I was just watching a webinar about local news, and one of the reporters said that a reporter in a small town in LA County had uncovered that the city manager was making like an eight or $900,000 salary, and it was evidence of corruption. And they were able to uncover that and save the government a lot of money. Um, so when government officials know that they're being watched, when people are keeping an eye on them, whether that be the reporter or the community, it's more effective, and it typically um, saves money too. Also, local news decreases polarization, and that's so important because when people have that shared vision of what's true and what's really happening on the ground in their own communities, it's easier to see that than it is on a national scale. It's hard for me living in Texas to know, to fully understand what's happening in the rest of the country. But I can understand what's happening on the ground in my own community. And as I share that knowledge with other people, we all operate on that shared truth that helps decrease polarization. And it also helps humanize people from other backgrounds and other ideologies, right? If you know that your neighbor is of a differing political party, it really helps humanize that political party, and that also decreases polarization. So these are just some of the reasons why local news is so important for our American democracy. Next, I wanted to talk about how to find quality content, because that can be kind of difficult in this day and age. Um, Local news outlets have been shutting down at a dramatic pace over the last 20 years, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But it can be kind of hard to know and to find a quality outlet in your area. So what you're going to look for is something that's locally produced on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And this is a screenshot from a newspaper that's published in my area. It comes out, I think, once a month, and it comes to everybody just in the mailbox. Um, and it kind of hyper focuses on some of the different towns on the outskirts of Austin. And it's somewhat useful. And so that's one of the local news outlets that I utilize. You also can check on your network news stations, and those are often locally produced and locally staffed. One thing that's important about that, though, is you want to check on the station ownership. There are some media conglomerates. Sinclair Broadcast Group is a really well-known one that do operate and have been criticized for operating from a certain political bias. So I would just invite you to maybe check on your local network news stations to see who owns them and if there's any information about them that is good or bad, and that can help you kind of inform your choices of what you want to watch. You can also look up your local NPR radio affiliate. Many have local reporters. And if you need help with it, you can visit with a librarian. I know our library has newspapers that they get in that you can go to the library and you can read them. If I were in a neighboring community, I know I could ask the librarian for help finding a news source that would help me understand that community better. They're just a really great resource, and they have a lot of expertise typically in helping you find what you're looking for. Okay, so we're going to talk about a big trend that's been building probably over about the last 10 years, and it's called pink slime journalism. And so the term pink slime comes from, it's kind of gross, it comes from meat filler. So it's this idea that there's this pink slime that gets put in meat sometimes that's used as a filler, and it's not really real. And so they call some publications pink slime publications after that. So pink slime news publications are They appear to be legitimate local news outlets, but they're often created to promote a particular viewpoint or a partisan bent. And they sometimes will use domains from local news organizations that went out of business. So they'll buy that domain and it will look like this is a legitimate news outlet, but it's actually coming from a very biased point of view. Some of them use artificial intelligence to generate content. A lot of them use templates, and they're created to generate money or influence a narrative. And there's three big companies that are producers of pink slime, and it comes from both sides of the political aisle. So there's pink slime outlets that are conservative leaning, and there's some that are liberal leaning. Um, Metric Media runs some in my area. I don't know if you can you see this? Pull up, Rachel, the Austin News.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is one in my area. So if I pull this up, um, it says it's the Austin News. Um, and you can see it looks like relatively legitimate, like as I'm scrolling through it, right? But one thing that I noticed as I click through, if I go to politics, all of the political stories are written from a certain political bent, especially if I go into local government. All of these stories are about the Republican senators from my state and the good things that they're doing. So that is like a big red flag if you don't see a variety of content. And it looks pretty generic. And also, you'll notice the bylines on here. There's no person writing these stories. It just says Austin News. Um, so that's another hint, and we'll talk more about how to recognize those. Um, but it's just really important to be able to recognize. Oh, I want to go back. Pink slime publications in your area because they can be really deceiving. Um, and actually, they found that currently there's at least the same number of pink slime sites as there are legitimate daily local newspapers. And actually, the last statistics I checked, there's actually more than there are legitimate outlets. So it's really something to be aware of, and it's something you might see come up in news stories about how there's this proliferation of like fake news sites and fake content. And these are some things to look for as you're trying to figure out if a local newspaper or a local news site is pink slime. Sometimes it's not a website, sometimes it comes in the mail as a paper publication too. Or there might be like a stack of them at the grocery store. So it's not necessarily always websites. Some things to look for a partisan political bent, lack of names and bylines, like I showed you from that one website, headline stories and photos that show blatant bias or sensationalism, or maybe there's just no variety, like I showed you on that last website. Lack of evidence or sources. So sometimes these websites use AI to just generate information based off of, um, based off the internet or based off of press releases that come from people, and that's not really original evidence or sources. There can also be a lot of questionable stories mixed in with legitimate looking stories. And that's pretty common. So you might, at first glance, think this looks like a legitimate publication. But as you study it more, you realize that there's some really questionable stories um, in there. Some things that you can do to research to figure out if something is a pink slime page is look at the site's about page to learn about the ownership and funding. So for the Austin one that I showed you earlier, I tried to find an about page on it and there actually wasn't one. And I think it mentioned being part of um, a specific media group. And so I clicked on that and that led me um, to that media group. I've seen other sites that are hyper partisan news sites, hyper local in my area that will say in the ownership that they are operating under a specific political bent, that they get funding from political organizations and they are openly um, trying to fit a specific narrative. And so that can be really telling. You can also look at what other outlets are saying about a specific story you might see in that publication. And that's called lateral reading. And might feel like a lot of work. It actually can be a really quick Google search. You can also use Google's about this result. I don't know if you've ever used that before. I know we've talked about this on here before. Hold on, I'm going to go back. But if you go into Google, let me see if I can pull it up. No, it's not going to let me. If you go into Google and you search for something, there's three little dots next to the search result, and you can click on those dots and it will pull up about this result, and Google will actually tell you more information about that result, about how long the website's been there, and about any other Google results that come up specifically about that website. So that's super helpful. You can also look at whether fact-checking sites have written about the organization. There are some fact-checking websites like PolitiFact, um, Media Bias Fact Check that may have written about the issue and will have some clarifying information for you. And then I just wanted to pull this up because this is really helpful information from the News Literacy Project. These are the standards of quality journalism, and so any news organization should be following these, using multiple credible sources, avoiding bias, having documentation for what they're presenting to you, being fair and treating sources with respect, verifying information, offering balance, and then also offering context. So these are just some things to keep in mind. That's what any quality outlet should be presenting to you. Okay. We're just going to talk briefly about some of the challenges to local news because I think that it's important to be realistic about what's happening with local news um, in order to be hopeful. Our hope has to be based on truth. And since 2005, the United States has lost a third of its newspapers. And in the same time period, two-thirds of journalists, so more than 40,000 people, have lost their jobs. And this has led to the creation of news deserts, particularly in areas that are underserved and struggling, such as, urban areas that are economically struggling, can be suburban areas, but particularly rural areas are really facing this crisis of having news deserts where there's no local news outlet anymore that's covering them. And the existing outlets, as I mentioned, there's been so many reporters who have lost their jobs. Their their newsrooms have been decimated, so they're really operating on a shoestring. There's not nearly as many reporters as there used to be. I remember one of the newspapers I used to work for um, is in a kind of a rural area in Nebraska, and the city's still pretty good size, about 40,000 people. And we had a newsroom with 7 or 8 reporters and 2 editors, copy editors, and then several designers. And I know that they are have just been um, decimated since then. I think they only have, like 2 or 3 local people working there now. So it's just really sad because there's so many issues that need to be covered in those areas, and there's just nobody to do it anymore. And it's estimated now that people living in more than half the counties in the US have limited to no access to a reliable local news source in any form. So that could be news, radio, TV news, radio, or newspaper. And that's really sad. That's really harmful to our democracy to not be able to have that outlet to news and that not be able to have that connection to good information about what's happening in your community. And so the hopeful side of this is um, over the last few years, there have been a lot of experimentation with new business models, and many of them have been successful. And that doesn't mean to say that they're not challenges, especially for um, more rural areas, but like a lot of bigger markets in bigger cities are having a lot of success with the nonprofit business model. So utilizing philanthropy and also membership and subscriptions and a little bit of advertisement. They're shifting away from using a heavy amount of advertising because that just doesn't work anymore, and instead are working to make it more of a nonprofit model. In a lot of areas, that's been really successful. There's a great newspaper in Texas called the Texas Tribune that operates on a nonprofit model. I know the Salt Lake Tribune is now a nonprofit, and so that's really hopeful. There's also a transition now into thinking of local journalism as a public good instead of a business that's meant to make money. And that's truly what it is. Local journalism is a public good because there's so many benefits to democracy and to our communities. And so it's really important for all of us to transition our thinking is that local journalism is not really a money making venture anymore. It's actually something that we need, much like a library or a museum. According to a recent poll, 85% of Americans think local news outlets are at least somewhat important to the well being of their community. So, this is something a lot of people agree on. Most of us agree that local news outlets are important. And most Americans believe that local reporters are doing a good job covering their communities accurately. So, in places where there is local news and people have access to it, they have a lot of trust in that outlet. And that's also really positive. Um, Compared to national news publications, people don't have a lot of trust in those outlets, but on a local scale they do. And so we want to connect people to those local outlets and help them build that trust. I think those are a lot of great reasons for hope. So I want to start to wrap things up by talking about why you should connect with local news. And so it's really interesting because there's two sides of this story. So the vast majority of Americans think that local news is important to their community. And at the same time, people are utilizing local news less. And we want to try to help shift that. And um, so these are some of the benefits to you as you try to shift and get connected with your local news outlets. You're going to try to develop a greater trust in news media. And actually, that's something that as we set up the Hope experiment and people did the survey before they began it, a lot of people mentioned wanting to feel like they could manage their news consumption better and not get so burned out. Um, and connecting with local news is really a big answer to that. It fosters trust, and it fosters a great connection to your community that is much less likely to make you feel burned out. It helps build a foundation of shared truth within your community. It fosters a better sense of connection and understanding to your neighbors, which, like we said before, reduces polarization because it humanizes people who have differing views from you. And then you get to hear the stories of those doing good in your area. I loved reporting on all of the amazing and positive things that people were doing in my community. It was such a boost. And I have a strong knowledge that there are a lot of people doing a lot of good around the country. And unfortunately, we don't hear a lot about that in the national media. And but we can hear more about that in local media, and we typically do. We can find more opportunities for civic engagement, and we often have a greater impact locally than we would on a national scale. So those are really valuable opportunities. We can feel better informed about local issues, and then we can become better prepared to vote. Because voting in national elections is important, but it's also incredibly important to know what's happening in your community, um, where your vote has an even bigger impact. Okay, so I have some invitations for you um, as part of the Hope experiment this summer, which is our summer program. It's a list of suggested things that you can do over the summer to try to build hope in our democracy and our communities, and I would invite you to participate in that. It's a great program. It's meant to be done at your own pace. You can do as much of it or as little of it as you like, and it's just been really fantastic so far to hear about the things that people are doing to build hope. So I would encourage you to identify reliable local news outlets in your area. If you are aren't sure what's out there right now, maybe take a few minutes today and do some Googling and find out what local news sources are available to you and which you would prefer. If you can afford it, I'd encourage you to subscribe or donate to a local news outlet. Um, like I said, the advertising revenue that newspapers used to rely on is just not working anymore. And so, if you are able to support a local news outlet financially, that's really helpful to them. Integrate consumption of local news into your regular media diet. So that could mean if you are a person who uses Instagram, it could mean um, following a local news outlet on your Instagram, and that will come up on your feed. It could mean finding a local reporter that covers maybe city hall or local government and following them on threads or on Twitter. Um, but finding a way to consume local news is going to be really important. You can also add local news typically if you use a news aggregator like Google News or Apple News. Um, you can often add local news outlets to that so that you see that on a regular basis as well. And then, like I said before, participate in the hope experiment. If you do these things, let us know how it went and how and whether it helped build hope for you. We want to hear about that. I really, truly believe that it will help you build hope as you get connected with local news. And this is a quote that kind of illustrates why. I actually saw this quote when I was on Instagram the other day, and it's posted by someone I follow, and it's a quote from Dance of the Dissident Daughter, and I just love it. And it says, "I needed to hear other people's stories in order to see and embrace my own. Sometimes another woman's story becomes a mirror that shows me a self I haven't seen before. When I listen to her tell it, my experience quickens and clarifies my own. Her questions rouse mine, her resolutions call forth my hope. Her strength summons my strengths, and all of this can happen even when our stories and our lives are very different." And I'll just tell you something that I loved about being a local news reporter is just telling people stories and witnessing the good things that were happening in their lives and the bad things sometimes. But getting to know them gave me a lot of hope. And I know that as you all connect with local outlets and you learn more about the people in your community and you get more involved, you will feel more hopeful. You'll feel um, like you can make a difference in your community and that you I think your perspective can be shifted and can benefit. So that's what I have for you today. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't
Hi.
see any. Oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
well, just Jalaire here. I was just took me a minute to unmute. I'm on my phone and I never know what to do. Um, I was just going to kind of, it's not necessarily a question, but I just a moment of like, yay, thanks for what you shared with us today, Meredith. I've been subscribing to my local paper for a while, and so I get like a daily email. Um, And that's been really helpful for me to just kind of connect, right? Like connect more with my community. One of my favorite features is called Johnny St. Vrain. The St. Vrain River goes through our town. It's the St. Vrain School District. My ward is actually the St. Vrain ward. So that's where the name is. But people write into him and they will ask questions like, what are they building on the corner of this street? Or hey, what are these old silos used for? Like just random, like whatever you want to know about something weird that you see as you drive around town or anything like that. And so that's been a really fun feature because people will sometimes will be driving along and my kids will be like, what is that? And I'm like, well, actually, Johnny St. Brain told me this in that little column. So that's just kind of like a fun one. Um, but I wanted to say that what you've inspired me to do today is you reminded me about like the local NPR station, um, and realizing like I get a lot of national news from the NPR app, but remembering that on the radio they're always breaking in with, when they do the national headlines, they always follow it with those, local headlines. And so and I'm remembering often in election years, the local radio does a really good job of um, profiling candidates. They often have candidates on for interviews. And sometimes I forget that that's out there until I'm like cramming for my ballot. And so you have kind of inspired me to make sure that I'm following that earlier this year, because I often feel like I'll hear about it and I'll be like, dang, there was a forum last night I could have listened to. Or it's only when I'm like, sometimes I'm not paying as close attention. And so then I'm like, okay, time to sit down and research my candidates. And I missed out on things that were totally accessible via my local radio, NPR, like public news stations. So
Yeah, I mean, I know
that's
a lot
that's
of
my takeaway today.
I love that. Thank you. I got two things from what you said. Two things that made me think of. One is another great invitation for people is to interact with your local news outlets. I can almost guarantee you that the people who work there would love it if you would give them feedback, if you would ask them questions. What about this thing? Could you write about this? Have you written about this? They would love it. Um, and also, a lot of local news outlets sponsor debates and things in their communities, and people miss it. And I know we're always looking for, I know I am always looking for information about candidates. And so I would just encourage you to, even do a search on if you have some local races that you're interested in getting more information about, especially if there's like a governor race or a senator race happening. See if some of your local news outlets are sponsoring debates so that you can tune into those. So, thanks, Jiller. Anybody else?
Let's see any. I do occasionally, you had mentioned the free newspaper that comes in the mail, and um, I flip through it. It has I think there's two that I get actually, but when I flip through and it, it wasn't actually until I started paying attention to media literacy through MWEG that I started looking at it with a more critical eye. And I was like, oh, this is a very biased
Mm-hmm.
news source. But at the same time, even though I can read it knowing that, it still gives me some, I'm still getting information. They still do a decent job reporting. So I appreciate that. So I typically go through and then it gives information about what's happening in my town, which helps me be informed about town council members, in upcoming elections, because we will have some of that too. Um, so I think it's okay. And we've talked a lot in our media literacy about having a balance. Like if you're going to read one on this spectrum, then you can read one on that spectrum and they'll balance each other out. Or you can try to just stay moderate, like AP and NPR is a little more center and, different things. So it's still just, it's a great thing to, don't throw them away. Just even if you just flip through it quick, you might see a headline that's like, oh, that's interesting to see that they're, the town is taking action on this, or they're going to be building that, or here's where my money's going as a taxpayer. So thank you so much, as always, Meredith, for helping us be smarter consumers of media, especially as we are approaching an election season. It's in full force here where I live. All the signs are out. Thank you for joining us. Next week, we will take the Thursday off for Independence Day. So enjoy your 4th of July. And we will be back on July 11th. We are going to have Hope in Civics with democracy theorist Harry Boyd. He recently had a piece in the New York Times, or excuse me, no, he recently had a piece in Time Magazine. And he's just going to come and talk to us about having hope in civics. And so I hope you'll join us on July 11th for that grow. And until then, we'll see you later.